Hello, my name's Josh and I do cigarette burns. And thank you all for coming down to today, which is the last of the Pete Walker retrospective, House of Walker. And we're going to close with Frightmare, which is on 35, and according to the projectionist who made it up, is nice and grotty. So that fills me with joy. Let's see. As cigarette burns, I'm not doing anything. I didn't really have anything lined up. I'm going to take a little break and have a bunch of stuff in the new year. But the Barbican has some great films coming up, including Lady Snowblood, which is absolutely fantastic. Japanese female samurai. It's easy to say it inspired Kill Bill, but it's a lot bigger and better than that. And they're following that on the 8th with one of the greatest spaghetti westerns by Corbucci called The Great Silence, which is also on 35mm and absolutely 100% worth your time, your money, and sitting there and watching and just getting blown away by the glorious Morricone and Nicolai score and Kinski in all his crazy. And now I'd like to introduce Jonathan Rigby, author, historian, actor, for introducing Frightmare. Thank you.
Hello. I think we can call this the 40th anniversary screening of Frightmare because it came out on the 5th of December 1974, which is next week. Don't believe the date given on Wikipedia or IMDb, by the way, that is wrong. So Harold Wilson was at number 10, David Essex was at number 1, and Frightmare was at the London Pavilion. Unfortunately, the IRA were also in London, and a bombing campaign in the heart of London rather deterred people from coming to see this film. So it didn't do as well as Pete Walker had hoped. I think it also has to be admitted that it wasn't really ideal Christmas viewing. I think people wanted to see a Christmas movie in London in 1974 will have gone to see Donald Sinden in the Disney film Island at the Top of the World instead. Now, you may find that perplexing, I may find it perplexing, but for some reason a film about a family of cannibals just didn't appeal at Christmas time. I have a little quote from the Daily Express here. I can't quite specify who the critic was, but he said, it doesn't pay to look too closely at the plot of this horror film. Much better not to look at it at all. All I can say is that the people who made this rubbish and appeared in it should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves, and that anyone attracted to it should head for the nearest psychiatrist. Well, I don't know if you know this film, but heading to the nearest psychiatrist is not a good idea because this film is extremely satirical, if you like, about the effectuality of psychiatry, if there is such a word as effectuality. Now, basically, the question you have to ask yourselves is, had Walker and his screenwriter David McGillivray gone too far? Because with House of Whipcord, which was at the same cinema, the London Pavilion, in March 1974, they'd had a huge hit. I don't know if anybody was here last week when I interviewed Pete Walker, but one of the most charming moments then was the fact that he had total recall of exactly how much money House of Whipcord made. He remembered how much it had made in its first week. He remembered how much it made cumulatively at the end of 4 weeks. But I'm afraid Frightmare didn't repeat the same performance. Now, the question for them after House of Whipcord was, how do we top that? How do we rub people up the wrong way? What ghastly subject can we come up with? And apparently McGillivray, who was only 26 at the time, a very young screenwriter, just rang Walker up and said one word: cannibalism. He'd seen a British film called Deathline, which came out at the end of 1972, which was about a whole dynasty of cannibals residing under Russell Square tube station. By the time the film gets to them, there's only one left, which is probably just as well for the budget. But it was a very, very powerful film, and I think probably Britain's first cannibal horror film. McGillivray was also inspired, of course, by the Andes air crash in 1972, which would, in time, inspire films directly based upon it. Now, McGillivray always liked to amuse himself and have a bit of a laugh. He actually came up with his own word. He coined a word for pathological cannibalism, which Gerald Flood actually says in the film, caribanthropy, he called it. Now, on top of just the basic gruesome theme of cannibalism, what was the deeper theme with which to rub people up the wrong way? Because in House of Whipcord, they dealt with the justice system. In House of Mortal Sin, they were going to move on to the Catholic Church, no less. What about this one? Well, this one basically dealt with care in the community schemes, as they became known in the 1990s. The thorny subject of letting mentally ill people out of institutions before they're ready. Obviously, this is a classic topic that was going to rub people up the wrong way. Again, do we know exactly where Walker stood? And the classic line in this instance is again given to Gerald Flood, who was a very popular TV actor at the time, playing the absolutely complacent Dr. Lawrence, head of the Lansdowne Asylum, when he tells his younger psychiatrist friend Graham, we didn't kick them out just for the fun of it, you know. They're completely cured, as sane as you or I. Well, of course, in Walker's film, clearly Dorothy Yates is not cured at all. Now, the film went into production just a few weeks after House of Whipcord had come out, so Walker was coining it in at this point. He must have been riding the crest of a wave. It went into production on the 8th of April, 1974. This is the script. This is an original script. I haven't the slightest memory of how I came by this, but the working title on it is Nightmare Farm. There's something very bleak about this film. Terribly bleak. All Dorothy's clients are sad and rootless people who think that her tarot readings will in some way improve their lives. And really, it's a kind of distillate of something that's become very popular recently, the idea that the 1970s were horrible. A kind of the grimness, if you like, of the 1970s. It's got so bad recently, this kind of perceived idea, that I believe there was a documentary recently called The 1970s Were All Right, Really, or something along those lines. But that bleakness was actually written into the script, so just bear with me a second. This is the beginning of the script. It is late Sunday afternoon in midwinter. The Thames looks grey and deserted. Against the skyline, the only signs of life seem to be blackening smoke from Battersea Power Station. We superimpose a title, London, February 18th, 1957. High angle of Battersea Pleasure Gardens, long since closed for winter. A solitary figure walks across the damp tarmac amidst the tarpaulin-covered sideshows. Closer angle, the man is Barry Nichols, an insignificant character of indefinable age, but probably around his early 30s, one of many occupying the 1001 one-roomed flatlets in Clapham or thereabouts. He seems unsure of himself as he arrives at one of the once gaily coloured huts, now half covered with a tarpaulin. He tries to peer into a murky window set high in the woodwork. Then he knocks at the weather-beaten door. A pause. The door creaks open very slightly. Barry squints into the gloomy interior. A tarpaulin flaps in the sharp wind. Now, there's no spoilers involved there, because that's the very first scene of the film. But I think you can see that this bleakness is right there in the script, as written by David McGillivray. This is just got number 23 written on it. I wonder if it belonged to the unit member number 23, but it is an original script because it deviates from the film a bit, not very much. It's clear that Walker actually filmed McGillivray's script very, very closely. The really overriding theme of this film is the cannibal family. If you're going to deal with cannibals in a film, it's always as well to put them in a family context, because families really, particularly in the 1970s, were beginning to be seen as a kind of consuming construct. And, of course, the classic example of that was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was made about 9 months before this film, hadn't been seen even in America at this point, and certainly not in England. A big theme of horror films of this time, starting with Witchfinder General, was the way that the older generation would destroy the younger generation. The younger generation were moving into the the so-called permissive society. The older generation were looking on censoriously how to deal with these young people who are having a far better time than we ever had. Well, in a cannibal story, of course, you can take that to its logical conclusion. You can have the older generation consume the younger generation. And in that context, I think it's very interesting that MacGillivray placed the source of Dorothy's illness, again, there's no great spoilers involved here, in the Depression, when meat was scarce and life was really hard, and you didn't mess about in boob tubes and platform shoes. You know, you had a really hard life. And so there's a kind of generational revenge involved here, just as there had been, by the way, in House of Whipcord. Now, I don't wish to indicate that the film is entirely bleak. There are in-jokes in this movie. Walker and MacGillivray were addicted to in-jokes. One of Dorothy's clients arrives at the so-called Nightmare Farm, which, by the way, was in Hazelmere in Surrey, and says, I read this advert in Time Out. And, of course, MacGillivray worked for Time Out at the time. Jackie, the female protagonist, is a BBC makeup artist, and we first see her applying a horror makeup to a disgruntled actor. MacGillivray and Walker both make personal appearances. MacGillivray is a young doctor who bumps into Graham in a corridor. Incidentally, that scene is not in this script. I think it must have been improvised on the day. And Walker is heard, not seen, as the defence counsel at the very beginning of the film, who is called Mr. Brunskill by the judge. The ultimate in-joke, really, is that at one point, Graham, the hapless and hopeless young psychiatrist, takes Jackie to see a film. He takes her to the ultimate date movie. He takes her to what is advertised on the front of the cinema as Blowout. Now, this was a Marco Ferreri film called La Grande Bouffe, which was a huge controversy at the time because it involved various Frenchmen, including Michel Piccoli and Marcello Mastroianni, who of course was actually Italian, but we'll ignore that, deliberately gorging themselves to death. So the idea of conspicuous consumption was very clear in that film too. But the in-joke basically is that they're apparently watching La Grande Bouffe, but the soundtrack you hear is House of Whipcord. Whether it was La Grande Bouffe or House of Whipcord, it is not a date movie, so I think it's just another indication of what a deeply ineffectual character Graham is. Finally, I'd like to point out that I'm sure you've noticed British horror films have made a huge revival in the last 10 years or so. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I'm not exaggerating, of British horror films have been made. And a lot of them have come up with an ingenious solution to a problem that has dogged British horror and fantasy for decades. The fact that critics and filmmakers in Britain have always privileged realism over fantasy. There's a huge innate snobbery in this country related to anything to do with fantasy. So how do you solve this problem? Well, of course, you unite social realism with fantasy, and as a result, you get a lot of films that have been rather crudely dubbed hoodie horror. Now, I'd like to nominate Pete Walker as really the progenitor of this idea of mixing social realism with fantasy. You won't see any hoodies in this film, but for instance, if you watch carefully the wonderful 1974 opening scenes set in a bar cum disco called the Toby Jug, you could easily imagine a remake which fits exactly into the modern mode. In fact, the film made after this, House of Mortal Sin, Walker initially rejected MacGillivray's first draft, complaining that it read like a play for today with murders. And that is very much fits, in many instances, the kind of British horror films we're watching now, plays for today with murders. I can't finish until I've mentioned some of the actors in this film. Rupert Davis was, of course, famous for playing Maigret on BBC television. Once he finished playing Maigret, he found it hard to shake the stereotype that had sort of settled upon him. And he started appearing in films like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and finally this. And his wife, Dorothy, of course, is played by Sheila Keith, who was Walker's talisman, as it were. Very scary actress, but he was the guy who spotted her latent scariness, because before this she'd played Lady Justices of the Peace and appeared in lots of sitcoms and even had quite a long stint with Noel Gordon in Crossroads. But it was Walker who decided that she was actually a home counties cannibal. She's routinely referred to by horror critics, and I think I've been guilty of this in the past. She's routinely referred to by horror critics in this film and others as an old lady. I guess if you're mainly interested in Caroline Munro and Madeline Smith and people like that, then I suppose Sheila Keith must have looked like an old lady. But in fact, she wasn't an old lady. She was 53 when this film was made, which means that I'm an old man if she was an old lady. But these actors appearing in these films had to face a lot of criticism. The Sun managed to head their review with the line, "What are stars like this doing in trash like this?" Well, I hope once you've seen it, you'll decide that they were very well advised to appear in this film, because 40 years later, we're still watching it. It's still very, very interesting, and it isn't trash by any standard. Thanks a lot.